In this podcast, two Gen Xers are taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting and reflecting on the cinema of the 1980s. We'll look at the hits and the flops, the studio blockbusters and art house indies, the critically acclaimed, and the universally reviled. The series is hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli, a writer and librarian, and features Dustin Morrow, a filmmaker, author, and professor of film. So pull on your legwarmers, crank up your boombox, and hop in the DeLorean. It's time for the Long Rewind. Welcome to the Long Rewind. I'm your host, Lisa. With me, as always, is Dustin.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're going to talk to you about how we saw movies in the 1980s.
Yeah, it was certainly quite different.
Yeah, or somewhat different. I mean, not maybe wildly, but very different. Yeah.
It felt different.
It did feel different.
And
yeah,
I don't know. This is one of those episodes where like it might be prudent to talk about nostalgia
Mm-hmm.
a little bit too, and
Yeah.
rose-tinted glasses and looking on your past. And
Mm-hmm.
because as I was writing up a few notes on sort of trying to remember how I found movies, how I learned about movies,
Mm-hmm.
and how I watched movies, I found myself getting a little like I missed it, even though
Yeah,
I
I do
realize
too.
now how incredibly easier it is in every respect to learn about films and find movies. Like back then, there were tons of movies that I wanted to see that I had read about in film guides and magazines and stuff that I just couldn't get. I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
the only, I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and there
Mhm.
was a video store in the town, but it wasn't very big. And the nearest Blockbuster was about a half hour away.
Yeah.
But even that Blockbuster didn't have, it was limited
Mm-hmm.
in what it had.
Mhm.
And, there was stuff I just couldn't find. And now like that's kind of a thing of the past. Like there's almost no movie today that you can't easily find on the internet somewhere,
Right.
if not on a streaming service, then on YouTube or the Internet Archive or some other obscure website from God knows where. It's very hard to like have a film that you really truly can't track down.
Yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'm going to sound like old man yelling at cloud here, probably a little bit. But personal philosophy, I'm not always sure easy is a good thing or the best way. Just because something is easy doesn't necessarily mean it's better or a better experience. Not all. Sometimes it does, absolutely. But I think there's an argument to be made sometimes for a little bit of friction.
Well, I'm definitely going to say, and I think this will be a recurring thing in this episode, is that because of that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, it's hard because of nostalgia and your experience of learning about stuff and watching stuff and finding stuff as a kid is going to be different no matter what era you grow up in.
Yeah.
But so some of this is when I say what I want to say is that movies don't feel as special to me today as they did when I was a kid. But I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's not because I'm just an adult now and not a kid. And like you're like finding this stuff as a kid, it's just it's different when you discover something as a 10-year-old than when you discover it in your 40s.
I think that's true.
But because there was fewer stuff, there was less stuff to see back then, and it was harder to get. And the ways that we consumed it were stricter in the sense that like we just didn't have it at our beck and call 24/7. We couldn't just start it on the web or on a streaming service anytime we wanted. It did feel more special.
Yeah, I mean,
back then.
that is one
deal. It felt like a bigger deal.
It did feel. I was just about to say. I think one thing I miss and try to get back when I can is going to the movies feeling like an event, or watching a movie feeling like an event, like a special event.
Yeah.
That's something I loved about it then, and would love to get back to a little bit now. It's a harder thing to achieve now.
Yeah.
I think
even just watching it on your TV because it would air.
Well, it was bound to time.
Yeah, and you, like if it was on at Thursday night at 8 p.m., you had to be there.
It felt like an event. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I think that's, as you say, nostalgia for sure. We gotta take it all with a grain of salt. But I do think there's something to be said for that. Again, old man yelling at cloud. I know.
Yeah. Well, and there was a lot more at stake in what you chose to watch because you didn't have a million things at your fingertips.
No.
You didn't have a million thumbnails on Netflix that you could just click on and watch 2 minutes of and then bail and then watch something else instead. You drove to a video store.
Yep.
You walked up and down the aisles. You read the backs of the video boxes. You thought long and hard about what is the thing I want to watch tonight. And then you paid for it and made a choice, and you were stuck with it because you got it home and it sucked.
Well, that was what you
That's
rented
what you
that
had
night.
for the night. Yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
could turn it off and watch regular television, but like it's not the same thing as like clicking on something on a streaming service,
And
which
you can easily bail, no
there's
problem.
and plus it was I mean, people that buy records talk about this a lot, right? And like collectors of physical media, just having the thing in your hands, to like leaving the video store with the movie in your hands. I mean, even just like the competitive aspect of getting it.
I was just gonna say
like,
that.
They would only get so many copies at the video store. You might, in my town, I grew up in a small town, and they got maybe three copies tops of the biggest movies.
Yeah.
And
you weren't always guaranteed to get
you weren't
what you wanted.
to get it.
No,
and like,
not at all.
Even like if you went in there and it happened to be in, like that was like a big score. And
100. Yeah, you feel so excited about it.
Yeah, so excited. Yeah. And so it made everything feel a little more special and
stakes.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of like haunting the returns bin. Did you ever do that at the video store where like, you walk around and kind of stretch out your time there as long as you can because they don't have the thing you want, but maybe someone will return it while you're there. So you would go and haunt that return bin area.
I mean, I would always ask them to like, would you mind going into the returns bin and just see what...
I didn't live in the same kind of place you did, so I couldn't do that. But yeah, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, and we're kind of weaving in the ways we discovered things. Well, we should talk about maybe get back to talking about the ways we discovered and watched things. How did we do that?
All right. Well, I mean, there was only really a couple ways to watch movies in the 80s.
Yeah.
This is, still the way, I guess. Well, that's not maybe true. I was going to say this is maybe the way most people watch movies today, but it maybe is not the case because I know most. Well, I mean, I'm a teacher and I work with 18 to 22-year-olds, and a lot of them don't own televisions, and they're film students. Like these are kids that love movies, and so they watch stuff on their laptops and on their phones.
Yeah,
and I'm not sure that they're seeing everything in a theater or even on a TV.
Well, I would say it's only the same in that, yes, we're all still watching them on screens. Things haven't gotten so wacky yet that we're watching them in a different way other than, they're all still screens.
Medium, yes.
There are people who would like for that to be different. There's companies working on that, but we're still on screens. So even if they're very small.
Yeah. So, okay. So there's going to be a little bit of, and hopefully maybe if you've listened to this podcast, maybe you have a small interest in this. And if not, that's fine too. There's going to be a little bit of biography in this podcast, more than usual.
Yeah.
Because we'll be talking about our own individual experiences. But hopefully that will be, especially if you're a Gen X-er, that'll remind you of things that you haven't thought about in a long time.
I mean, that's
and if you're younger than a Gen Xer, then maybe this will be just a little revelatory for you, and you'll a peek into the lives of two Gen Xers and how they made their way through the world of film back in the 80s.
And no matter how old you are, you'll think about the ways you do it yourself and how it was for you when you were a kid. So
what was your access to movie theaters when you were young?
To movie theaters specifically?
Yeah.
Not very much. I mean, this is just it's still probably true. Just being a kid, you don't have a lot of money.
We should remind people you grew up on Long Island.
Yes. So my geography was quite different to Dustin's. I grew up on Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City, for those who don't know. So it was a much more densely populated area. There was, we had access technically to a lot more, but I will say as a kid, as any kid, most kids don't have as much access as they do as adults. I didn't really have any money of my own or very little money of my own. So I had to either be taken by my parents or somehow have allowance money to go, which was pretty rare for me. So I didn't get to go to the theater, to the actual, multiplexes or whatever, duplexes as they were back then, very often. So it was the most rare for me out of all these options and truly an event for me. So like as a teen, when I was getting to go more often because I did start to have money of my own, or as an adult, I still back then and still I kind of like to dress a little nicely to go to the movies because it still feels special to me because back then it was just so much more rare. It wasn't something my parents took us to do very often. But it's not that we didn't go, but it was rare and just truly an event for me. So what about you? I mean, and I guess I should say, because this is important, most of the theaters that I remember going to had more than one screen. And sometimes it was only two, but eventually they were more multiplexes and they were often attached to malls. So that's a big thing in the 80s too, was like going to the mall to go to the movies.
Yeah. But the era of the multiplex was really more of a 90s thing.
Maybe that was more, I guess it was more duplexes.
And certainly like
back then.
The addition of like stadium seating.
Oh, yeah, we didn't have that. No.
The 90s. For sure.
That wasn't, no, definitely not.
That might have even been like late 90s.
I don't think it was early 90s by any stretch.
Well, as I said, I grew up in a farming community, a small town in rural Illinois, Western Illinois, about halfway between two towns that had one had 25,000 people, the other one had about 35,000 people. And each of those towns had theaters. One of them had two screen theaters. The other one had 3 2-screen theaters. There's only 2-screen theaters. No repertory cinema. No dollar second run cinema.
Yeah.
It was all first run, and they tended to get the same movies. But I will say that I had parents that love movies.
Yeah.
And we went constantly, and that's probably, I think there's 2 reasons I got into film and became who I am today. One is that my parents loved going to the movies, and we went almost every weekend when I was a kid. We just saw everything.
Wow. Yeah.
So most of the movies that we'll be talking about,
amazing,
even though I was a little kid during this decade, I saw in the theater.
Wow.
The other thing was the invention of the VCR and the ability to watch movies over and over again, tape them off a TV, and have my aunt tape them off HBO for me because we didn't have cable because I lived in the country and you couldn't get cable in the country.
Yep.
And those are the 2 reasons I think that I got into film really seriously and loved it. The VCR and frequent attendance at theaters.
Gosh,
for sure.
I should say, I realize I lived in a suburb of New York City, which would have had, and still of course does, have repertory theaters and second run, all the kinds of movies that you would ever want to see. But I really didn't have any access to that. Again, I was a kid. I certainly was not allowed to go to the city on my own. And going to the city was a very rare and special event. I did see one movie in the city, now that I think about it.
Was it The Black Cauldron?
It was. We went to Radio City. Radio City at the time was doing this thing where they were running 2 different films and you chose one to go to. And there was a little stage show, I think, beforehand. And you got a commemorative watch to take home with you. And one of the movies was Return to Oz, and the other one was The Black Cauldron, and that was the one my parents took us to see. And I remember it was amazing to us, and we got these Black Cauldron watches. And I wish I could remember. I just don't remember anything about the stage show at all. But there was one. I remember that there was.
Is that
one.
where you got that Black Cauldron watch that you wear every day?
I wish I still had that watch. I remember getting it, but I don't have it anymore. No,
sadly. What a shame.
It is a shame.
You could probably get it on eBay.
Yeah, you probably could. It'd be interesting to see what it even looks like because I don't remember. But it was a big deal.
Other places that we saw movies in the 80s, basic cable was one. I didn't, as I just mentioned, I didn't have it. But when I was a kid, I had a babysitter in town, and everybody in town had cable. And by town, I mean a town of 1,000 people. But I just happened to grow up on a lake out in the country, and the cable companies would not run cable out to where we lived, and so. But I would watch all the basic cable I could when I was at my babysitters or at my aunt and uncle's, who also they lived in town. You guys didn't have cable as a kid.
We did
right?
not have cable. No, it wasn't that it wasn't available, but it just like wasn't in the budget. We just weren't. We didn't have cable.
Yeah.
But it's true that therefore most of my movie experiences were with TV in some way, whether it was network TV or PBS. PBS was a big one for me kind of throughout my life, as you know, they ran a lot of old movies. That was one of the, as you know, I love a lot of old black and white movies, and PBS is probably part of that. We were late adopters of the VCR, so we didn't have that through all of the 80s. We did eventually have it. And probably one of the biggest places if I may transition into this, one of the biggest places I discovered and quote unquote rented movies was the library. I mean, the library was my biggest source for movies because it was free. It didn't cost anything. And they actually, I mean, I have very fond memories. They had a whole room in our library devoted to videotapes. And just like going to Blockbuster, you could, browse the shelves and pick them out and take them out. So I have really good memories of. That's where I saw a lot of things. Was taking it out of the library. Y'all know I'm a librarian, right? So maybe in the same way that you were influenced by in your profession by your young movie experience, perhaps some of this influenced me too.
It's funny because that's the way I get most movies now.
That was the chief way I got movies back then.
But our local library was too small. It didn't have VHS tapes.
I mean, I guess that's where I got lucky growing up. Where I grew up was, we had pretty well stocked libraries back, on Long Island. So they had a lot of stuff.
So you mentioned, but network television, that was another, I mean, we did have that. And that was a huge source of movies for me. Of course, they were edited for TV, so there were a million movies that I taped off of TV and would watch over and over again, and I knew the commercials as well as the movie. To the point where the commercials were kind of like part of the movie to me almost.
I could see that. Definitely for me too.
Also, I would see these movies when I got older, when I was in college or whatever, and I would see these things for the first time ever uncut, and I'd be like, wait, what? There would be whole massive passages.
Yeah, that you'd never seen.
I was a big Grease 2 fan as a kid, and I had taped that, and they had cut that entire reproduction song. And I just didn't know that, although I did see that in a theater at a birthday party, believe it or not.
Oh, interesting.
But I had no memory of it. I was way too little.
Yeah.
And taped it when I was a little older off of network TV, and had no idea that number existed.
That's
and
true.
I remember it blew my mind the first time I saw Grease 2 or again, when I was older. I was like, wait, what? What is this?
It reminds me of how they would, of course, sanitize the language on network TV too. So they would loop, certain words, and you wouldn't know.
When I was
totally,
a kid, I was convinced that the Breakfast Club, that Judd Nelson was like, fudge you all over the place. It was a lot. There was a lot of that.
I mean, that reminds me of another way I sort of saw movies was on airplanes. I mean, sometimes you were kind of like, I don't want to say forced, but there was one movie for the airplane, right? For the whole airplane. Yep. They showed it on a screen at the front.
They would project it at the front of the airplane, and you got headphones and you would watch it.
Yeah, and I have a really vivid memory. I forget where we were even going, but sometime in the 80s when I was pretty young, we were on a plane and the movie Frantic was playing. I couldn't hear it because I didn't. Great movie. I didn't have the earbuds, but I could see it. So I have memories of images from Frantic, watching it on a plane when I was very young. And then finally, as an adult, I got to actually see Frantic and find out it was great.
The first movie I ever saw on a plane was Beverly Hills Cop.
Oh, wow. That's
and
pretty good.
My parents almost didn't let me watch it because they were worried about the language. Yeah. There was too much profanity in it.
Yeah.
And finally, they were like, well, we're stuck on a plane.
You got to let him
poor
watch
little
it.
kid, let's let him watch the movie. And so I watched it, and they had, of course, sanitized it for the airplane, just
That's
as
what made
they
me
would
think
for
of
TV.
it. Yeah.
And I remember thinking, what are they talking about?
What's the problem?
There's no profanity in this movie. What are they smoking? Yeah,
So
that was
funny.
that, and then it was actually a double feature on that flight.
Oh, must have
It
been a
was
long
Beverly
flight.
Hills Cop, and then the second movie was The Mean Season, which is
Oh,
a great
wow.
film noir
Yeah.
with Kurt Russell that few
Ooh,
people know about, but they should. It's
very
a really
cool.
good movie.
Yeah, so it was kind of, I don't know, it just came to mind
Yeah,
as
airplanes.
another
God, yeah, I
way
hadn't
of
even thought about that.
because you were just kind of forced to see what everybody else was
Yeah,
seeing. Even if you didn't fully watch it, you still maybe have a memory. And then later on, you go see the movie and you're like, oh, yeah,
yeah.
this is good or not
So the
good
way
or
it
whatever.
worked in the 80s for
Yeah.
network TV was that it was usually about, I want to say it was about a year and a half after a movie would come out in theaters before we would
Mm,
get it on TV because it
okay.
took the window was 6 months for the VHS tape to show up in rental stores,
Mm-hmm.
and then it would be like another 6 months before it would show up on pay cable, and then
Mm-hmm.
like another 6 months before it would show up on regular television.
So interesting.
So
Yeah.
it took forever to get movies on network TV after they had been in theaters, like a
Yeah.
really long time, like 18 to 24 months, I think.
Yeah.
But it was a big deal when we finally got them. They had, movies of the week.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
we'll do a whole episode about TV movies.
Which were movies that were made specific. These weren't like movies that made their way to you from the theaters.
Yeah,
They
stuff
were
made for
their own
television.
thing. Yeah.
And it was the 80s were an era where TV and movies, in terms of the talent pool, were very much segregated. That if you
Yeah.
did television or if you did movies, it would be considered slumming to do any kind of television.
Mm-hmm.
So we had movie stars and then we had TV stars.
Yeah.
And so the TV movies it wasn't like today where there was just tons
There's a
of
lot more
cross-pollination
crossover.
and you
Yeah.
would see, all of your biggest stars also showing up in TV shows and movies.
Yeah,
That
definitely.
just didn't happen back then.
No, not really.
But yeah, so the movie of the week was a big deal. I remember as a kid, and I know you know this,
Mm-hmm.
the Disney Sunday night movie
Oh, yeah.
was a big deal because
Mhm.
they showed a lot of the first run Disney movies, like a lot of the premiere movies for kids
Uh-huh.
would premiere in that 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock
Yeah.
Disney Sunday night movie, which aired opposite 60 Minutes.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely a fun one for me. I remember really loving the Disney Sunday night movie and feeling excited for it.
Yeah.
Speaking of sort of network TV and movies, we had in New York WPIX Channel 11, which at the time was called New York's movie station. And so they would, they were one of the places where you could go to see.
Isn't that also the channel that would show the Yule
Oh,
log?
yeah.
The fireplace
my,
for like
my favorite Yule log.
24 hours at
No, it
Christmas
wasn't
time?
24 hours, but it was, the Christmas morning, they would play it for a couple hours. And that's my favorite Yule log. Yeah, you can even go see it on YouTube for years. I think they've gone back to doing it now. They stopped for a while, but I think from like the
But they
60s
were otherwise
for
all
decades.
movies all the time.
No, it wasn't all movies all the time, but they did show lots of movies. And I have memories that, like you were saying, seeing commercials for movies was almost part of the movie. That was one of the places where that was so true for me because they would kind of show the same movies every year at kind of the same time. Like they would have a cycle almost. And Legend was one of the movies. So I would see these commercials for Legend and be like, what's that? And I don't even think I ever got to see it on Channel 11, but I would see the commercials and be so intrigued. And there were lots of other Irreconcilable Differences was maybe one of them. I mean, I don't know. There were all these movies that would like come up and I would see the commercials for them. And so they kind of burned themselves into my brain. So later when I was an adult and got to see them, I was like, oh yeah, that used to be on New York's movie station or whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It was interesting when you said that about commercials because that was probably one of the places I saw the most movie commercials.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Another place we found movies was the sister to basic cable, which was premium cable or pay cable.
Oh, yeah.
Which was HBO, Cinemax, and Showtime in the 80s. I think that was about it.
Yeah.
The movie channel, TMC, which is long defunct, but was kind of the sister to Showtime. And the Disney Channel was a premium cable.
When was that in the 80s? Did they have the Disney Channel?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I didn't know if that was later.
No,
yeah.
It was around. It was maybe toward the end of the 80s, I
Okay.
think, but it was around.
As I said, I had no access to any of this
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah, if you didn't have basic cable, you
I
weren't
did
gonna
not have pay
HBO.
cable. No.
Yeah, and obviously I didn't have it either. But as I said, it was at we had it at my aunt and uncle had it. And my babysitter had it.
Yeah.
And so I watched a lot of it there. And so a lot of the movies that I found and that I would otherwise never have watched, other than the fact that they were the thing that happened to be on when I was at those houses, were things I discovered on HBO. And those are some of my fondest, some of my favorite movies from the decade are these movies that are totally obscure or things that I would never have seen other than the fact that they were just on constantly.
Yeah.
And there were so many movies that are burned in my brain. And one thing I like to do when I'm feeling particularly nostalgic is go on YouTube and watch old HBO commercial breaks.
Promos.
It had its own, they had their own, it had its own thing. It had its own aesthetic. Like it had all these famous little animations that would run in little segments like video jukebox. And
ways to fill time between movies.
Because they showed movies uncut. And so they were running all different running times. And so they would have to fill in like 20 minutes in between movies.
And they didn't really show commercials other than like promos,
no, just
right?
for the movies.
So, yeah.
Or for whatever other programming they were doing.
Yeah, it wasn't commercials.
So just I have a lot of warm feelings toward those and that famous HBO introduction, which is like this diamond that shows up in space and then rainbow lights shoot out of it and you go inside the word HBO and you go inside the O. People that know what I'm talking about, it had this theme. Da, 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 da,
oh yeah, even I know the theme. Sure.
It ran before every movie, and boy, does that just hit me in the
chills
in the soft, gooey chocolate chip cookie of my heart. It hits me in the warm spot. And so, but what I was going to say was, I go and watch these things on YouTube.
Yeah.
And if you look at the comments on all of those, there's this whole generation of Gen X kids like me who discovered this core group of movies that are either like cult movies or just pretty obscure movies or movies that probably shouldn't, that like bombed in the theaters, but just became things because HBO flogged them to death.
Just exposure.
Yeah. You just saw the same,
I
don't know why, as like an 8-year-old, I was watching Mommy Dearest time and time and time again.
Wow.
This crazy HBO or Hollywood melodrama about child abuse. And yet I did.
And Joan
I saw
Crawford.
it many times. Beastmaster, of course, like the big joke. Hey, Beastmaster's on.
That's what HBO stands for. Yep.
Super Fuzz.
Oh
which is
boy.
a really ridiculous Italian comedy. Chomps, which is this movie about this little robot dog that looks like Benji. Just those movies were just on all the time.
Yeah.
And if you watch HBO on the regular, you couldn't help but see them probably multiple times.
Yeah, it makes me think that it's worth noting. I mean, I think most people today, you think of HBO as this big prestige channel. They've got all those wonderful high budget prestige shows. Back in the day, they were kind of rinky dink. So they were just trying to, fill programming with like maybe the cheapest movies they could get is my guess. So that's, and they would show things over and over. So
I'm sure they had, they had licensing deals with studios and they probably bought packages of movies and they just showed, but I found a lot of my, that's how I think I discovered Rad.
Yeah, some of your favorite
discovered Tag, the
movies.
Assassination Game.
Yeah, such a good movie.
There were just so many, and so many of the movies that I mentioned on this podcast that are B movies that I love are movies that I just totally stumbled on HBO when I was a kid.
Yeah, well, and I guess I just thought it was worth mentioning that that's how it used to be on HBO. It was not these big prestige, high budget shows. It was like, no,
they had a few shows. Like they had,
they did
was a
have
show called
shows.
Not Necessarily the News. They had a show called First and 10 with Delta Burke, which was like a set in the NFL. It was a comedy about a football team. Boy, that was maybe about it for the 80s. Let's see, they had like Arliss and Dream On.
Those were like the 90s, though, I think.
Shows.
Yeah, they didn't really start picking up with the shows till the 90s.
They would show boxing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, some
they
sport.
Would have occasional concerts like Kenny Rogers and Dolly
they would
Parton
do,
did
not
a big
live
one.
Aid, Comic Relief was
Comic
a thing.
Relief, Comic Relief Live was on HBO.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they did special programming. They also had like kids programming. They had a show I used to love as a kid called Brain Games.
Oh.
Which was this like, it was just like visual puzzles.
Oh, interesting.
I love
Yeah.
that. Fraggle Rock was
Oh
big.
gosh, I was so jealous of people who had HBO purely for Fraggle Rock. I was so devastated that I couldn't watch Fraggle Rock.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I was really mad just not having basic cable. That I always wanted to watch the USA Cartoon Network.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
With that train, the Cartoon Network Express.
Yeah.
It had like way better cartoons than we got on, us poor kids got on regular TV.
I know. Believe me, I'm with you. Yeah. So anyway, back to
back to the thing.
movie
So,
discovery and access.
Yeah.
It was an interesting place to. You're right. I think people discovered stuff there through sheer repetition.
It was also important to the pubescent development of young men. Cinemax, After Dark, Friday night, late night Cinemax. Like we all knew about it. Everybody knew about HOTS. And,
about what?
HOTS. HOTS.
Okay.
It was a screwball comedy about a sorority.
Oh,
it's exactly what you would think it.
I see.
It was like, it was that Porky's era.
Yeah, no, okay. Yeah,
like
I just had never heard of it.
Teen sex comedies.
Right.
Yeah. HOTS was the one that was always on every Friday night on, and every guy in my school, by guy, I mean little boy, had seen HOTS.
Little prepubescent boy.
Yeah.
This was
it was
something.
our first exposure to women without their shirts.
This is the first time hearing of it, only because, as a little girl, this was not something we girls that ever came up for us. I didn't know. I mean, I'd heard of Cinemax. I knew that it was that thing for guys and for boys, but didn't know specifics.
I mean, they used to run like Sheena all the time.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway, video stores.
Yes.
That's the other big way that we got movies. Did you have like a neighborhood video store when you were a kid that you would go to? Could you walk to a video store from where you grew up?
Well, so I'm thinking very early on, there was one video store I knew of that was in a shopping center that technically we could walk to. It was not something I did. It was a little far. Most of that later on when we got Blockbuster, this was like an independent place, I think, that I'm thinking of, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was the first one I remember going to. And then later on we got, Blockbuster and Hollywood Video, but that wasn't till later. And we couldn't walk to those, but there was a time, this was more like in the 90s and early 2000s, when we had like 2 or 3 that you could easily access, driving 10 minutes or something. But there was one. We didn't go to the actual video store that often, again, because our library was so well stocked with videos. And so it was better for the budget to go to the library. But we did have them for sure. You have major experience with video stores, though. Like you have a lot more experience with that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's fun.
From the 80s.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, my dad was a pharmacist who co-owned with his brother a small town drugstore in this town of about 1,200 people. And they were the first ones to bring video rentals to that town.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah. They had a kind of an area with like, 12, 15 shelves.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I, some years ago, was looking through old family photo albums, and stumbled across a picture of that rack of videos.
Yeah.
And oh my God, I was so excited to just have that photo. I treasure that photo now because that rack of videos was, those were the first movies that I saw over and over and over again, which, as I said, is part of what made me fall in love with film, was the opportunity to rewind and pause.
You were able to really examine
and start to
them.
understand that like there were people that made this and that there were decisions that went into why this looks the way it is and why it tells the story the way it does. And just starting to figure that out as a little kid, who,
That's
unlike
huge.
the kids of today, had no access to any kind of like online education about film production or film studies or anything. Like I really literally had to figure it out for myself. And as a kid growing up in the middle of nowhere in Illinois.
I love that you did that through videotapes, though, that this occurred to you. I mean, that's amazing. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I can name all of those films and they're not all good, but they were, like, the way it worked at my dad's store back then was there was a company that they would lease the videotapes. Videotapes were $90 in the 80s.
They were very expensive. People weren't usually buying them for themselves.
You couldn't buy them
back
really.
then.
Yeah. Like there were very few what they called sell-through VHS tapes, like Top Gun,
meaning
was
straight
one.
to consumer. Yeah,
Crocodile Dundee was one.
Yeah.
There were very few movies that came out at like a $20 to $25 price point.
Well, and remember also that $90 and $20, both of those were a lot more money in the 80s. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot now, but it's way more in the 80s.
So the way it worked at my dad's store was there was a company that would bring like once every, I don't remember what it was, every week or 2 weeks, this guy would come in with a big box of movies and he would take out the ones that he would look at the rental data. And he would take the ones that weren't renting well in this town and he would replace them with other videos, or he would just bring like new releases.
Wow.
And then he'd be back in a week. But there was like 100 movies that he never touched.
This is your Glass Drug 100.
Yeah, it was Glass Drugs was the name of my dad's store. And it was this was like the core, I thought of it, like the core of my film education. So yeah, there were so many those movies I just watched over. Max Dugan Returns. There's a reason like that's one of my favorite movies. I watched that thing. My dad used to make fun of me even when I was a kid because I would call him several nights a week and be like, "Bring home Max Dugan." Yeah. And he'd be like, "Really? Again?"
Max Dugan is a wonderful.
You've watched it 3 times this week. Are you sure? I'm like, yeah, bring it home. And I would just like, you know, or every time I went into the store, into town to go to his store, I would just be like, well, I'm here. I might as well grab Max Dugan.
The wonderful, we should say, the wonderful Neil Simon comedy with,
Marsha Mason and Jason Robards and Matthew Broderick.
Donald.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor.
It's wonderful. Yeah, it's really wonderful.
So yeah, that store, he used to rent out the VCRs. Which is hard to remember, but that used to be a thing.
That was a thing.
People didn't own VCRs necessarily, and they would rent these gigantic. They were in like big plastic suitcases.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
They were like built into the suitcase.
Yeah.
So yeah, they used to rent those out as well. We did eventually get a video store. It didn't take too long. Called BJ's Video. It was right down the block from my dad's store on the town square.
Yeah.
And so as a kid, I started working pretty young at my dad's store. And at the end of the day, I would go down to the video store every single day.
No doubt.
5 days a week.
Yeah.
And I would rent 2 movies.
Wow.
So I was watching like at least 10 movies a week from the video store.
Yeah.
Like spending probably basically my entire salary because I wasn't being paid very much. Thanks, Dad. So yeah, I just, I used to buy they would sell me their posters for $1 when they were done with them, or like the cardboard standees, like advertising movies. I would get those and like slowly built my room into like this little shrine to the movies. We also could rent videos from the local grocery store. Mm-hmm. That was the second place that got them after my dad's store.
Right.
The problem there was that they didn't have any room for them, and so they put them up above in the frozen food area. They put them up above the frozen, so you couldn't access them. Like you couldn't pull the boxes down and look at them.
That's funny.
And to get the movie, you had to go up to the counter and ask for it, which of course led to the story that's still told in my family to this day. Where
it's a good story.
I asked my mom to get the Keenan Ivory Wayans blaxploitation spoof, "I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker," for me, and my mom reported that she was very embarrassed to go up to the desk and ask for "I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker." Yeah, this nice Midwestern lady.
Your parents love you very much.
And then, as I mentioned, there was a Blockbuster Video about half an hour away, but you could only keep the movies for 2 nights, and so But that's how I saw all the old Hitchcocks. That's how I got all the Monty Pythons. They had all these VHS tapes that had 2 episodes per tape. Do you remember that? And
I think so.
Rent.
Yeah.
And so I rented all of Python's Flying Circus, over time there. Yeah. But the video store was huge, and I used to hang out there and talk to the employees for hours on end.
Yeah, I bet.
Was just,
I bet. They probably got to know you really, really well at these places.
Yeah, I didn't have I went to a very small school. My graduating class was only 40 students, so there wasn't anybody else in the class that was like movie obsessed like I was.
Right.
So I was starved for like people to talk movies with.
Yeah.
So I just hung out in the video store like a lot.
Yeah. I think it's a not uncommon story for filmmakers of your age and our age to have that story of like,
or like they worked there,
worked
right?
at the video store or that's the Tarantino story.
Tarantino story that he never studied film formally in any way. He just watched everything at the video store where he worked.
Well, that is what I was thinking of, but I'm sure other filmmakers have that story of either hanging out there all the time or working there or whatever. It was, I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about video stores and browsing and just how that was a way of discovering things. And you would discover things just through their like the cover of the tape and be like intrigued by what you saw on the cover of the tape, and you'd see the same tapes over and over and the same image.
I mean, I suppose there's some small correlation with like clicking through thumbnails on like Netflix.
It feels a little different. I don't know that I can explain why, but
that thumbnail might appeal to you in some way. But
it's similar.
You're right. I mean, the video art, there are books of VHS art.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and they're just so interesting. And there were so many movies being made just for B movies, especially for the straight to video market.
Yeah.
That would have these unbelievable box art.
Yeah.
Just incredible. Like these sword and sorcery movies ripping off Conan. And they would have like these, muscle men with like a gargoyle on a sword impaled,
like a heavy metal situation.
The fire of a volcano while the half-dressed lady is hanging onto their leg. And then you would take the movie home, and it would look like it was shot in somebody's backyard.
It wasn't as good as the cover.
Like some guy wearing a plastic helmet. It was like, oh God, ripped off again. But like, I mean, that was the thing.
Yeah, definitely.
And but it was so much fun. It was so much fun to browse the aisles at the video store and discover stuff and like.
It was almost as fun a way to spend the time as anything I can remember. I'm thinking more of the 90s here because that was when I spent more time in actual video stores. But that would be like part of the experience of your Friday or Saturday night movie outing would be going to the video store and like hanging out and looking at
going
the movies.
With your friends
I mean, it was like it was part of the fun. I've told you this story. I didn't see this movie till I was with you later, but I remember very distinctly the cover of April Fool's Day.
Oh, yeah,
the wonderful Fred Walton movie. Yeah, her hair is and I remember being really intrigued by the cover of it, but too afraid to watch it. I'm so glad I've seen it now. It's great.
And had dinner at the director's
He's wonderful. So the Walton's so great. But yeah, just seeing over and over because it was in the same place in the rental store. So, you would see it when you were like coming around the corner or whatever. And just the braid and the noose was.
No, I can remember all of these like enigmatic covers. Like,
of things you never rented, but were like, ooh, that's interesting.
Like, what is that? That looks so scary. Or like a lot of the horror movie covers were so intense.
Yeah, they were.
It's just like, ugh, what is that? It was just an amazing way to find movies. And
this is maybe a little bit different than your experience, but this is making me think of discovering movies through friends or through sleepovers or being exposed to them through sleepovers. I mean, I'm sure this probably still happens today. I would imagine, kids having sleepovers and watching movies together. But I remember, I'm thinking specifically of being younger at sleepovers and the girl holding the sleepover wanting to watch a horror movie, and I was really afraid of horror
slasher movies were big at sleepovers.
So
I remember those at birthday parties.
Yeah, and just being afraid and like having to hide somewhere else.
I had a birthday party where I made all my friends watch Ninja 3: The Domination.
Yes, wow.
Including the girls who I'm sure were like, what is this? Why am I watching this?
Yeah, at the time.
I remember going to somebody's birthday and watching Howard the Duck. And even then thinking like, this is one of the worst pieces of garbage I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's funny the types of movies that would get shown at sleepovers. I remember
crazy stuff.
I remember showing The Secret of My Success at a sleepover. And it is a great movie and we all enjoyed it. But I look at it now, I'm like, we were maybe a little young for that. I mean, it's a little bit of a sex farce thing going on there.
Like the biggest sleepover movie?
Yeah, that was a big one.
Generation
definitely,
girls. Yeah,
definitely.
It was always Grease, right?
That was one of them. Yeah, we were big into Grease.
Maybe John Hughes.
Probably some John Hughes. Yeah.
There was also, as I mentioned, like this interesting competitive aspect to going to the video store that you don't get in streaming. It's not like it's not like you click on something on Netflix and they're like, I'm sorry, 100 people are already watching this.
Yeah, generally
Like,
that's not true.
But
yeah.
but at the video store, like there
Mhm.
were people, people would be there right when it opened. I was always like reading Premiere and stuff. Like we'll talk about that in a
Yeah,
minute.
we should
but,
talk
like,
about that. Yeah.
reading stuff to try to figure out when things were coming out so I could
Oh,
put holds on
yeah.
them weeks early.
You were allowed to put holds on stuff?
I was. At the
I don't
video
remember
store in
being
our
able to-
town, you could put a
Wow.
hold, you could reserve movies.
This is the advantage of like knowing them, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
Yeah, that didn't happen
Yeah.
that I knew of where I lived.
The other thing I would do, this was late 80s, but when Laserdisc came out,
Oh boy.
I mean, it's a terrible format now, but like, you're looking back on it, but it was movies on VHS were never released in widescreen,
Right.
but on Laserdisc,
Yeah.
you could get things letterboxed. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I would have to drive. Again, it was like a half hour because none of the video stores anywhere near where I grew up,
Mhm.
had laser discs, and I didn't have a player, so I'd have to rent the laserdisc player.
Oh, I didn't know you did that.
Yeah,
Wow,
I would
okay.
go. I would go to Macomb and rent a laserdisc player, and then like 10 movies, and I only had them for like a night, so it would just be like all night.
Staying
I'd be, like,
up all
staying
night.
up watching because I wanted to see them widescreen. It was I was
Yeah.
renting stuff like Apocalypse Now
Yeah.
and like just heavy movies too, because I wanted
Right.
to see them in
Wow.
full wide. It was the only way to do it. There was
Yeah.
no access to widescreen movies.
Boy, you really were meant to be a filmmaker. I'm trying to think whether I even realized that there was a difference until much later in my life.
Yeah. Well,
I
I
don't know.
remember as a kid watching, I don't know if this is the first place I learned about it or not, but Siskel and Ebert did an entire episode on the difference between pan and scan and widescreen,
Oh.
trying to dispel
Wow.
the
Okay.
myth that widescreen was bad because people thought
That they were
like,
missing something.
yeah, that they were like, hey,
Ah.
I didn't buy this TV so that half of it could be black bars, right?
When it's actually quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They also
Oh, so
did an
interesting.
episode on why colorization was bad.
Oh, so they were really trying to educate the public
yeah.
about like film technology. That's so
Yeah.
interesting.
They would do, it was around Christmas time, they would do an annual like 1 hour special episode of like their video picks. And they
like
would give each
rentals,
other a
yeah.
gift at the end of
Oh,
the episode.
I didn't know that.
And
Yeah.
they would, but they would talk about like what was going on in video. And I think it was on those episodes where they would talk about like
Things like
widescreen and
colorization and pan and scan and
pan
stuff.
and scan, yeah, and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. I remember, I remember one year, speaking of Apocalypse Now, that Siskel gave Ebert Apocalypse Now on Laserdisc,
Oh, wow.
and Ebert opens it up and he's like, "Thanks, I already have it."
That's so them, I guess. The only Laserdisc experience I ever had, I think it was outside of the 80s, but it's 80s related. My uncle is the only person I knew who had a Laserdisc player, and he had Top Gun, and that
Oh,
was
sweet.
that was his way of showcasing
Yeah.
his
Well,
Laserdisc
hey, what a movie
symptom,
for that era.
symptom
What a
system.
movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
To,
So
to showcase your home, your setup.
yeah, that was his
Yeah,
showcase.
yeah.
So that's the one Laserdisc.
Did you
memory
have
I
a front loading or a top loading VCR?
We had a front loading because, again, we were kind of late adopters, so we didn't have the top load. I think of as an older version.
It is. We had ours in '83. It was an absolute workhorse. It was still going when I like all through college.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it was great. It was a Panasonic. However, it did not have a wireless remote. It had a wired remote.
Wow, it's old school.
Which I used. So
Yeah.
that wire would like be draping 15 feet across the living room.
Yeah.
The only thing the remote did was pause, fast forward, and rewind.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Huh. So interesting.
Good times. All right. Let's talk a little about how you learned about movies.
Yeah.
Like, because we didn't have the internet, obviously.
Nope.
And
Yeah.
so how did you find out like what was coming out and what you wanted to see? How did you learn about the behind the scenes of movies
Yeah. For me, I think a lot of it I was really into the newspaper entertainment section. We had, Newsday was our sort of local newspaper, I guess. And on Sundays, I mean, there was always some kind of entertainment section, but on Sunday specifically, there was like an actual literal separate paper almost that was all about entertainment. And I used to love looking through that. They would talk a lot about movies there. Just stumbling on them on TV or seeing preview commercials on TV, just like I talked about New York's movie station. That would be a way to learn about them. Entertainment Tonight the TV show was a big one.
I watched Entertainment Tonight. Mary Hart and John Tesh.
Yeah, should we explain what Entertainment Tonight is for
it was,
people who don't know?
I think it might still be on.
Maybe it's still on. I don't know.
It was an entertainment news magazine show, essentially.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it at the time, but essentially what it was like 90% EPKs, electronic press kits.
Yeah, and
which are these little press reels that are created by the studios to promote their movies that have like, ostensibly they're like behind the scenes looks at the movies, but really they're these carefully controlled, carefully produced, fake behind the scenes things.
Yeah.
And they would just run them on Entertainment Tonight. But you're right, like that was a way to learn what movies were coming out.
It was on every day. For us, I think it was like 7:30. For you, it was probably
it was like 6:30. It was right before prime time.
Yeah, right before prime time, and half-hour show. And I just thought it was the coolest. And I didn't know till you told me. I think when I was very far into adulthood that this was all EPK stuff. But
it wasn't all EPK,
or
but
a lot of it
was mostly EPK. Yeah,
I mean, or press junket kind of stuff.
Yeah,
totally. But I loved it. I mean, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, so was I.
It's how I learned about
Mary Hart. I remember hearing this even when I was a kid, and I don't remember where I heard it. That Mary Hart's legs were insured for over $1 million.
Oh yeah. I wonder if that's true.
Did I ever tell you that I met her?
You did, I think, and she was a very nice lady, right?
She was very nice.
Good things about. I forget how you met her.
I was in an LA Kings game, and
the
she
hockey
knew
team?
the guy, the hockey team, and she and her husband, who was this very old rich guy, had seats right at the glass.
Oh yeah,
and they were friends with the guy I was with. And so as they left like halfway through the game, and they were like, "You guys can take our seats if you want." We were like, "Hell yeah!" So we ran down there. And
well, that's cool.
I sat in Mary Hart's seat at the Kings.
She seemed like a nice lady.
She was a nice lady. Yeah. I mean, my interaction with her was all of 45 seconds, but she seemed like a very nice lady, very attractive, lovely lady.
So that was one way. I mentioned before friends, sleepovers. A lot of my friends did have cable or went to the theater more often, so they would talk about stuff.
Yeah.
The Oscars, that was a big way that I would learn about movies, and you could see clips in the Oscars, which I liked.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned like magazines earlier, so things like Entertainment Weekly.
That was later though. That was 90s.
Okay, so that was maybe more of in the 90s. I really got into things a little bit more.
Entertainment Weekly started. I had it from the very first issue, which was February 1990. It was about.
Wow, okay.
I think it was about Twin Peaks.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was an early adopter of Entertainment.
Yeah.
Weekly.
So I mean, I guess that was later then, but I guess most of my print experience was probably the newspaper entertainment section.
I was in love with Premiere magazine.
Yeah, such
which
a cool
started
magazine.
in 87.
I
also had that from the very first issue, which I think was, if I remember right, it was Broadcast News, like William Hurt was on the cover. But it was the only, like, it wasn't the only, but it was like the most prominent movie-centered, movie-focused monthly magazine, and I subscribed to it for its entire run. I absolutely loved it. It was kind of the bigger format than your average magazine.
Yeah, I don't remember the trim size, but it was big.
These every issue had these like cardboard, I don't know if you remember this, these like cardboard cards. There were like 4 of them. And on the front would be a poster for a movie that was coming out that month. And then on the back would be a bunch of like fun facts about the making of that movie.
I didn't know that.
And you could rip them out. They were like 4 by 3. Maybe.
Okay, like a postcard.
And I would pull those out and I would hang them on the walls in my room. And I just had hundreds of them hanging on the walls in my room. And weirdly, like those cards were a way that I learned about a lot of movies.
That's why they put them in there, I assume. I mean, I didn't really... I started again to sort of have my own money more like in the 90s. So that's when I could buy things like magazines and things like that. So I guess I didn't really get into them until the 90s.
Yeah. There were a couple others, like there was Fangoria, but that was more horror film focused, and that wasn't so much my bag. There was Starlog, which was a science fiction focused magazine. I would get that one occasionally.
That's cool.
My dad's store had a magazine rack. And if things didn't sell, like I could grab them.
Oh, okay.
So I used to grab like a lot of like teen magazines too, which were more targeted at girls, but like they would have like stories about movies. And
Actually, that's true. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I was into those too, but again, that was probably more in the 90s where I would get things
Plus,
like
I had
Bop
a giant crush on Alyssa Milano.
Yes,
So I used
she was
to,
big in
tear
the
out her little 8x10s.
Teen Beat, Tiger Beat.
Tiger Beat, and Bop, and all those things.
I loved that. I loved those. Oh my God.
TV Guide was just a good source.
Yeah, I love
too.
TV Guide.
I don't know about you, but I used to crawl through TV Guide, and I would get a ballpoint pen, and I would circle all the stuff I wanted to tape or watch.
100%. Yeah,
just like going through it.
I think some of the TV Guide experience for me was a little bit like of envy because you'd look at them and they would have the section, they would divide they had a grid that would show you all the programs.
Oh yeah.
And the top of the
I know
grid,
what you're talking about.
Yeah, the top of the grid was the network stuff. And then there was a point at which it would be cable and you'd be like, well, there's all the stuff I can't watch. And it would be all this great stuff. And,
Again,
so there'd be all this
growing
envy.
up in the country, it was like you were a country kid or you were a townie, and I was a country kid. And it did feel like the haves and have-nots. It felt like the setting for a great movie where we uprise and
a tale of two cities, so to
fight
speak.
Back against the haves. I know exactly what you're talking about. All the stuff on the lower half of the grid. Was
the lower half of the grid was cable,
basic cable and premium cable. And man, I was so mad. Because the other thing too was none of my friends cared about movies the way I did.
Right, like
and
you
they
said,
all had HBO.
Yeah.
So it used to drive me
wasted
bananas.
Yeah, I can see that.
I did have a great aunt and uncle. I had two great aunt and uncles. I actually had an aunt in San Diego who would tape stuff off HBO and mail me the VHS tapes. She was great. And then I had a aunt just in the town near where I grew up, and she would tape things too. She would always forget that she was taping something for me. And so she would start taping it, and I would get the movie that I had asked her to tape, and then she would let the tape run out for 6 hours. So tapes were 6 hours back then. And so I would get 4 more hours of just whatever was on HBO after the movie I had asked her for. And I always watched that stuff. And that's, again, another way that I just stumbled on that's how I fell in love with Tag, the Assassination Game. How that became one of my favorite movies. That just happened to be behind like Star Wars or whatever the heck it was I had asked her to tape for me. Yeah,
this is something I know you and I talk about a lot. It's a nostalgia you and I both have. And I hope that kids today have a way of this happening for them. The serendipity of just stumbling upon a movie, which happened a lot, whether it was on TV or, as you say, you had a videotape that someone let run and you discovered this movie you didn't intend to watch.
Yeah. I don't know how that could happen today.
I don't know. There's a way. I don't know. Usually you do. I mean, maybe unless you let it run, sometimes it'll
like
suggest a movie after
on Netflix.
Or YouTube or whatever you're watching.
But even then, you see what's coming, and like
you do, yeah. So it's not like
the same. And there were so many movies like that I would not catch the beginning of.
Yes,
like Somewhere in Time was one of those where I came in 10 minutes late and I was just like mesmerized by it, and then it took a while for me to learn what it was. The Warriors was another one.
Oh wow,
that was one of those. A lot of Gen X kids will tell you this story, but you would be, your parents would go to bed, you'd be staying up, you would be dozing in and out on the couch, half asleep. And a movie would come on at 2 a.m. And you would miss the beginning. But you would wake up on the couch and you would just be like, what is this? And you would have this kind of like experience where you weren't sure you like had even seen it or if you had dreamed it or like, and there were a lot of movies that not a lot, but there were a bunch of movies that I found that way, and The Warriors was one of those.
Wow.
Just this like surreal, strange.
Imagine coming in the middle of The Warriors. You're like, what am I watching?
Yeah. I remember watching that from like 2 to 4 a.m. on a UHF channel.
Frankly, that's
in the 80s.
That's kind of a great way to discover The Warriors in a way. Yeah.
In broadcast television in the 80s, there were UHF and VHF channels. And so there were your main networks. There were 3 and then 4, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then toward the very end of the decade, Fox. But then we had these UHF stations, which were all local stations. And they had to fill programming because they were not licensing programming. They weren't getting programming from the networks.
Right.
So it was just all kinds of it was mostly like old syndicated sitcoms and TV shows, like action shows and stuff. And but a lot of like movies too. And that was the way I found a lot of, especially the lower grade, like the B movies.
I mean, I guess
and genre movies I found through those UHF channels, like in the middle of the night And that was just
Yeah.
felt like a really special way to like discover stuff. back
Yeah.
then.
I guess I didn't ever think about it, but maybe that movie station, WPIX, that I was talking about, that might have been a UHF station. I mean, it did show a lot of syndicated stuff and movies. So I guess that's what it was. It did have its own news,
Yeah.
news broadcast. But
I'll
yeah.
also say this too, just about stumbling
Yeah.
upon a movie like on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Those movies were not programmed for you.
No.
There was
No
no
algorithm.
algorithm
Yeah.
working to
Yeah,
feed you
that's true.
something that you would know you would like. So,
Yep.
for example, like Somewhere in Time, which is this very sentimental, romantic, it's a
Mm-hmm.
romance.
Yeah, very much so.
It's a time travel movie,
Got
but
a little
it's really a
sci-fi
romance.
to it, but yeah.
Not something that like a little kid would necessarily
Or a little
think
boy
would,
maybe at the time.
a little boy would
Yeah.
love, but like, so there was no reason. If I had read about that, like in the TV guide, read a synopsis of that movie, I never
Yeah.
would have watched it.
Right.
It was something I stumbled on
Yeah.
and just fell in love with. And so there's something to be said for like not having an algorithm
Yeah.
that
I agree.
is designed to just feed you
What it
stuff that
thinks you'll
looks like
like.
everything else you've already seen in your life.
That was the great thing about the serendipity of that time, was that, yeah, you're right. It had nothing to do with what you might like. And so you get exposed to things and be like, oh, this is great. And I might not have chosen it. And I love that. I mean, whether it's a book or a movie or anything, being exposed to something that I wouldn't have chosen, but that ending up loving it is a great experience, I think. Enlivening.
So there were like TV specials on big budget movies that were like the making ofs. I remember the making of one of the Supermans.
Oh.
I remember watching that being a big deal. I remember watching the making of Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, the Star Wars.
It was called
did
Classic Creatures. That was the name of the
Oh,
special.
wow.
Yeah. There was a James Bond. When Living Daylights came out, there was this hour-long James Bond, look back at James Bond, and that was like my first big exposure to that. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I had watched Octopussy and View to a Kill many times, but I wasn't familiar with all the older ones.
Right.
So that was really cool. And just TV commercials, of course.
Yes, of
and
course.
trailers.
Yeah.
When you would go to the movies, there were nowhere near as many trailers as there are now. You would maybe see two or three.
I think. Yeah, maybe three.
Yeah,
right.
it wasn't like the half hour of trailers that you get nowadays.
And they didn't show you commercials either.
That's true. There weren't any TV commercials.
All of this stuff is new.
Although at Christmas time, our local theaters, I should say, they would all do this, would show slides of local businesses.
Oh, yeah. We got the slides. That was always, but I mean like the actual produced car commercial or whatever that you see now.
No, thank
we
God.
didn't have those. Yeah.
No. I can remember some TV commercials for movies.
Oh, sure.
So potently, more than the movies in some cases.
Because you probably saw them over and over. Yeah.
Especially like you said, I wasn't into slasher movies in that era either. So I remember being really little and seeing like Friday the 13th commercials and being pretty scared of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Being like, I'm going to stay away from that. There was one called Slaughter High that was really quite a disturbing commercial to be broadcast on TV. And that thing felt like it was on all the time. I remember being really scared of that. Yeah. Anyway. The last way I want to mention that I would find out about movies, because I think I mentioned this to you once before, and you had no idea what I was talking about.
Okay.
But in the movie theaters where I saw movies, in the chain was called Carmike, Carmike.
Carmike Cinemas.
Carmike Cinemas, yeah. Mm-hmm. They owned the theaters in the towns near where I grew up. And they, in the lobby, would have pamphlets.
Wow.
These little pamphlets, and they were called, I want to say they were called Film Facts. Okay. Was the name of it. I could picture what they're looking like. It took me a while to Google even to find some, but I actually did find some online. Some people had scanned a few. But I was starting to think I was crazy. But that was one of the major ways I learned about them, because they listed, you would fold them out. They were trifolds, and you would open it up, and it would have like some quiz questions about movies, and it would have like a little bios of actors, and it would have ads, of course, for local businesses. Yeah. But the inside of it was just listings of all the movies that were going to be coming out in the next 6 months.
Perfect.
Like one-line log lines for what they were.
That's great. Yeah.
And so I used to study these things pretty closely.
I mean, I would have loved, I just don't it's possible they had them and I just didn't know. But yeah, I would have loved that.
Yeah.
But I just don't remember.
If anybody is listening and you remember these things, send me an email. Because sometimes I feel nuts, but
I know.
I'm pretty sure they.
I believe you. It makes perfect sense. It's just not something we had. Yeah.
The other thing I did was I had a couple of those guides. I didn't have the Leonard Maltin guide.
Oh, you mean
but
like
I had
books?
a couple that were kind of like that.
Explain what these are. This is like a book.
Yeah, they were. Well, Leonard Maltin for years and years. Yeah. Roger Ebert put out one too called the Roger Ebert Video Home Companion or something like that.
Right.
Maybe that was the Leonard Maltin one. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maltin's was the really famous one, but it had thousands and thousands of movies in it. It was just a guide to kind of like
almost an encyclopedia,
kind of like every movie ever made, although that wasn't anywhere near
it was
true,
a lot of movies.
But it was a lot of movies.
Right. Yeah.
I had a big blue one. It was called like rating the movies or something like that.
Right.
And that's how I found out about a lot of older movies. Just learned that they existed and learned that I wanted to see them.
That's really cool. I mean, again, this is something I remember being able to look at the library. I never purchased those guides, but they would have them in the reference section, and you could, if you stumbled upon it, you could take it out and just sit there and page through and look at information on all these different films. Yeah.
Anyway, we're over an hour, so we should probably wrap up. But
I
just want to say, like, I hope we don't sound like, get off our lawn, like everything was better back when we were kids, like, I mean, everybody says that because everybody idealizes their childhood. And if you're talking about like something that you feel as passionate as I do about movies, then of course there's going to be some idealization, because I'm almost telling you, this is like almost like the story of my life in some ways, talking about this stuff. I mean, it's really how I fell in love with the thing that I love more than anything in the world. And so of course there's going to be some nostalgic aching in that.
Yeah, of course.
Explanation.
Well,
but I really believe this. I guess what I'm getting at is that I really believe that like it did feel more special. There wasn't the glut of material that there is out there.
Spoiled
it's not
for choice. Yeah.
There weren't like 12 billion TV series with big movie stars in them.
Yeah.
Like, I'm always amazed at how often I'm learning about like series that I didn't even know existed that star like these huge stars.
You just can't keep up.
Just, like,
There's too much.
What is all this? And
it's a lot.
It just wasn't like that back then. It was there was a little more scarcity in what you had, but also like it was just
it made it special.
It was harder to get at it,
and
when you did get it, it felt like a bigger deal. And I can tell that's true because, as I said, I work around 18 to 20-year-olds, and I can see, and these are kids that are studying film, and so these kids ought to care more about this than your average 18 or 20-year-old. And yet I can see in the ones that I know that they just don't care about it the way that like I cared about it. And I feel like a lot of people cared about it in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, that said, I would love to hear, like, there must be some younger people out there who have some like great childhood movie memories. And it would be interesting to hear.
We should do an episode. We should do an episode, invite a millennial and a Gen Z in to talk to us.
Yeah, I would love to, because they must have some, there must be some really great like memories of wonder of, movies or something from their childhoods. And it would be interesting to hear how that differed or was the same or whatever. But yeah.
I mean, I guess the thing I'm most curious about is like how hard was it for them to see the films they wanted to see?
Yeah.
And how did discoveries work for them?
How does discovery work for you?
How were they, what was their version of like stumbling onto something that they had no intention of liking, let alone even watching?
Yeah, like they wouldn't have chosen for themselves.
Yeah.
And it could be through parents or, other things. But it'd be interesting to see. But yeah, I also, I do think there's a psychological basis to the specialness of not having as much access, for having to work for something a little bit. Which you realize like really does make us sound like, I mean, it's like the 80s cinematic version of
we had to walk through the
I know,
snow
it
every
is.
morning to get to school in our bare feet.
But
for,
I think the difference is I don't think we're complaining about it. We value that experience to some degree.
for sure.
But I do realize, again, I
Well,
sound
yeah,
like
I
the
mean,
old
I'm not
man
saying it to
shaking the
imply that like a 20-year-old today could never love film as much as I do. That's not what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Yeah,
I'm just trying to say that there has to be some, when you have instant 24/7 access to every movie ever made,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that has
to
to
anything.
in some way, you have to be processing movies different.
Yeah.
There's just no way that can't be true.
It's different.
I mean, it's
I'm
true.
sure.
Like, look at how people think about popular music, you know? It's
right, because it's all streaming now. You don't have to
and
buy
like
it. Yeah.
once Napster came along and you could
Right.
get any piece of music for free.
Yeah, there's an
it just-
expectation
it-
of
you know, it,
quote
it-
unquote
it
free.
changed the industry. It
Right.
in some ways devalued.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, it's just there's just no way their brains can,
Or anyone's brains. I
or
mean,
anybody's
any of our
can-
brains.
yeah,
It's not.
can
it's
work,
everybody.
can think about
Yeah.
this stuff the same way as it it did back then.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, thank you for listening so much. I hope that this hasn't been like entirely boring. I hope you've thought, that it's not just a biographical journey through our own childhoods, but rather maybe, maybe we've caused you to think about something that you remember from your own childhood and your own way of discovering films, and think about your own relationship with the movies that you love from when you were a kid.
I mean, nostalgia's fun, right? There's a reason we engage in it. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Okay. See you soon. You've been listening to The Long Rewind. The program is produced by Dustin Morrow and hosted by me, Lisa Molinelli. If you enjoy the show, please consider hitting the subscribe button, leave us a good review on your podcast app, and tell your friends about the program. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.